today, the important person who's speaking at the seminar is Jesse Suki. He is an attorney. He's been in the news the last couple of days for some valid reasons. But he is a practicing attorney. He has worked both public and private sector. And he too has an interest in what goes on in the land use built natural environment nexus. I've seen his work, known him for what, 10 years, give or take. Climate change. He's been at HART. He's currently HCDA executive director. He used to be director of State Office of Planning. So he's been around the block to see what is really important out there and how we make some of this happen on the legal side. So with that, Jesse.
Thank you.
Aloha, brother. Welcome.
It's official now.
It's official. All right, Jesse's got the floor.
Hello, everyone. So is this a class or is this a? It's a class. Okay. So great. So I'm going to be talking today about land use and permitting. I have done a lot of work both in the public and private sector, and advising clients about projects and how to do it right in the land use and permitting process, but also advising boards and commissions, the Land Use Commission and the DLNR, Department of Land and Natural Resources. And so I'm going to talk about some of the big land use laws that I think you should know about if you're working in the area of land use law or interested in how you can affect policy or change or even have influence on projects as they come about. And then I'm going to be talking about some of the stuff I've done as I go through that are related to some work we did in climate change and so forth. And then I'll talk about HCDA, Hawaii Community Development Authority, and what we do. And then I'll talk about some of the implementing green infrastructure things that we do specifically at HCDA. So start off big and then get small. So I always like this illustration. It's actors in the planning process. I've heard it once said that it's the same characters, different cast. And so the issues are always the same, right? And if you look at it, a big, it's a former ag and I can't afford to farm anymore. And then so a developer comes around and says, I have plans for your property. And then the poor beat up planner, that's where I've been, is do I have to appear at another public hearing? He's all beat up because, either way, you're never right. There's a planner. No more growth. Our schools are overcrowded. The recent resident, and it will take at least 2 more years to update our master plan. It's a county planner. I've been there too. Where will I live? The next generation, and then the historian preservationist is we must preserve farmlands, woodlands, wetlands, floodlands, steplands, flatlands. These are all regulatory requirements, by the way. So, and then you got the elected official scratching their head. We need economic development and affordable housing. Sound familiar? How do we make this happen? And how about a moratorium? Let's just stop everything. And then the attorney, this is funny. Think about practicing law. No matter what you do, your decision will be arbitrary, unreasonable, and capricious. So those are the standards for overturning a board decision, by the way, or government agency decision. If we can show that it's arbitrary, unreasonable, or capricious, we can overturn it. So, and attorneys make money on both sides. So, yeah.
I'm sorry. Could you speak up a little more, please?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So, big land use laws. So, one of the big land use laws that govern land use in Hawaii, and more than land use, is the Hawaii State Planning Act, which is Hawaii Revised Statutes Chapter 226, which was adopted in 1978. And at the time when they adopted this law, there was a lot of change happening in Hawaii. It was a couple decades off of statehood, and the economy was expanding. A lot of tourists were coming in. The agricultural industry was sort of tapering off. So decision makers in the community wanted to figure out, how do we have sensible growth, sensible development. And so they passed the Hawaii State Planning Act after some fairly big public outreach and discourse across the entire state. And the purpose of the Planning Act was to serve as a guide for future long-range development of the state, identify goals and objectives and policies and priorities for the state, serve as a basis for determining priorities and allocating limited resources, not only with land, although that's specifically how it ends up being interpreted as being for land use decisions, but also for public funding and human resources and other issues. Improving coordination amongst the federal, state, and county plans. So zoning is based on community plans, which is based on the statewide planning. And it establishes a system for planning and plan formulation across the state. And this is an illustration I use to sort of lay it all out. State Planning Act, Chapter 226. And part 1 of that chapter, there's the overall themes, goals, and objectives and policies. And then there's some priority guidelines. I don't know why they did it this way, but they have the overall theme, goals, and objectives in the first part. And then at the end of it, they have the priority guidelines. And then in the middle, they have statewide planning system. So I would have ordered it differently. But so the overall theme, goals, objectives, and policies are the big things, big issues. So population, economy, physical environment, facility systems, and sociocultural advancement. One thing you'll note as you go through all of the state land use and environmental laws is that those elements of sustainability are always in there in different ways. They might have not have called it sustainability back then. They usually refer to what they called carrying capacity. That was the big issue, population growth. When should we cut it off? How do we stop all this crazy growth? But today I think we talk more about sustainability and the 3 legs: economy, social, cultural, environmental. So when you look at this, these are actually words from the law itself. You can see that economy's in there, environment's in there, cultural advancement. And if you look at the laws, you'll see that there's those 3 legs sort of scattered in there. The themes reemerge. And then for priority guidelines, so once you have these big overall theme, goals, and objectives and policies, there's these priority guidelines, which are specifically focused elements of the State Planning Act. By the way, the State Planning Act is the statute, because I had that question once when I was at Office of Planning, when one of the legislators asked me, what's the state plan? And I thought that was funny because they passed the statute. That's the state plan. Okay, so that's unwieldy because it's difficult to amend a plan if it's a statute, but that's how it works. That's how it's set up. So their priority guidelines specifically talk about economic development, talks about specifically population growth, crime and criminal justice, specifically speaks to affordable housing and education. And when I was the director of planning, we added 2 new priority guidelines, and that was sustainability. We wanted to bootstrap the Hawaii 2050 plan, if you're familiar with that. The Hawaii 2050 plan is a great document. It was sort of a refresh of the State Planning Act. It was a statewide community participation, not as much as actually when it happened for the State Planning Act, but it was statewide community involvement. And they came up with what they wanted the future to look like and some issues that they thought should be addressed. It really followed the same the same elements if you look at the 2050 plan, but there was no legal standing in it. And so when folks who were working on the plan approached me and they were trying to figure out how do we get this into some kind of decision-making process, we thought that the priority guidelines would be good. So what this means, well, I'll talk about what that means in the planning system. And then climate change adaptation. That was fun because although there was a lot of contention around climate change, and in fact, at one point, you couldn't use the word climate change if you wanted to get anything past Congress. I think it's still that way. So you had to talk in code, resiliency, and that sort of thing. But Hawaii was very open to talking about climate change adaptation. And we felt like the plans in the state needed to talk about adaptation, which is responding to changes caused by anthropos. I never get that word right. That Latin word that means human-caused activity, impacts. Anthropomorphic.
Yeah, that one.
Who knows it? And not anthropogenic, but related. It's the Anthropocene period or something like that. Yeah, that one. That's why you're here and I'm not. Okay, so adaptation because of human causes in history as an epoch in time. So, okay. So lot of policy in the state had been addressing how we minimize our impact, greenhouse gases and that sort of thing. So we looked at adaptation, which sort of goes to what this is all about and what you're studying in these series of lectures, is how do we make ourselves more resilient? How do we develop our built environment so it's more resilient? And how do we preserve green infrastructure so that we're more resilient? So all of these elements were captured in the priority guidelines. Okay, so what? What does this all mean? All these great things. So the statewide planning system. All agencies are supposed to have these functional plans, and these functional plans lay out based on these elements. They're supposed to evaluate all of these elements and be consistent with them. The functional plans are how we're going to spend and budget for the next 5-year cycle. And so all of the CIP and priorities are supposed to be based on this. Now, we have
CIP?
Capital Improvement Project, which is important in government because that's big ticket, big money items, buildings and so forth. And well, I think that's a separate topic. So anyway, so all of these priorities are in the statewide functional plans. Unfortunately, we haven't updated many of them in recent history. It was a big deal back when the State Planning Act was passed. There was a refresh of many of them in the 90s in agriculture and education and what else do they do? Transportation and so forth, but they weren't updated. But recently, the Office of Planning updated the housing plan, and also the agricultural plan has been updated. So that's great. The other part of it are county general plans. And this is actually where we see the State Planning Act alive and well today. Counties can't adopt zoning unless they adopt county general and community plans. And those county and general community plans have to be consistent with these priority guidelines and these overall objectives and policies. So climate change adaptation and sustainability has to be considered in their plans. So that sort of trickles down sort of in a hierarchical way into zoning and then site development. And we at Office of Planning, when I was there, and they still are, working with counties as they update these community plans, because there's decennial updates of some of these plans every 10 years or every 5 years, that they incorporate some of these elements in there. So there's long range plannings about climate adaptation. So that's great. And that ends up in zoning. The other thing I put in there was special management area permits. So the county plans, so Oahu has a general plan for all of Oahu, and then they have community development plans or community sustainable development plans. So basically the general plan is for the whole island. And there's a picture in here that I'm going to show you about what that looks like. And then plans for districts like the Kola Poko, and then there's another plan for the urban core, and it talks about the layout, and then zoning is based on that, right? So if you get an SMA permit, special management area, that means your project is in an area that has been designated as a special management area, it's the coastal areas. You need to be consistent with the plan, which is a big deal because on Maui, for example, there was a hotel who wanted to have a bar in an area that was in the SMA because the hotel's on the SMA. And they did not want to obtain an SMA permit, and they were sued and they lost. And the court said, you have to follow the plans, which is if you're a planner or you care about long range planning, that's great. So plans have the force and effect of law in some cases. And district boundary amendments, which is the land use commission process. And I'll talk more about that later, but they need to consider all of these priorities when a project is proposed. And then the state programs that I talked about, CIP, CZM, the land use commission is specifically discussed in the State Planning Act, and so is the Board of Land and Natural Resources. So TMT permit should have evaluated the State Planning Act. So the other one is the state land use law. So that was the State Planning Act. Okay, now we're talking about the state land use law. That's another big one. So the purpose of the state land use law, Hawaii Revised Statutes, Chapter 205, preserve, protect, encourage the development of lands in the state for those uses which are best suited for the public welfare. So that's a broad statement of policy. But when you get into the criteria that's set for whether or not you can develop a project in a district, it's very detailed. And the 3 legs of sustainability are in there. There's, you need to evaluate the economic impacts, the social cultural impacts, the environmental impacts. You know, you need to do the cultural assessment, all of that stuff. And it's usually wrapped up in an environmental impact statement, Chapter 343. So throwing numbers at you, I'm an attorney, I can't help it. Now, implementation, how is this all implemented? There's a 5-year boundary review. There's district boundary amendments, important agricultural, and that special permits. So that doesn't mean anything to you, but I hope this helps. Not that one, this one. This shows you where the 4 land use districts are. So this is what LUC does. There's an agricultural district, there's a conservation district, there's a rural district, and an urban district. So you see all the green, agriculture, conservation is all the white. All the white stuff is usually when the boundaries were initially set up, it was forest lands, coastal areas, generally, conservation. Conservation is regulated by DLNR, not the Land Use Commission. Rural, it's a hybrid urban ag, not too much of it. It was sort of an experiment in law, never really took. Urban. Urban is where counties have full authority for zoning. They can do whatever they want so long as it's consistent with their plans. The statutory plans we talked about. Agriculture, there's some limitations on the size of lots, on what you can do. You know, all this debate, for example, about housing in the agricultural district. You're not supposed to have residential in the agricultural district. You can have workforce housing. Workforce housing. Workforce housing is housing that's accessory or appurtenant to the primary use, which is agriculture, so people, farm workers and so forth. Unfortunately, it's also been interpreted as what one would call gentleman farmers. So, you know, I'm from Maui, and you'll see like these big ag lots where, you know, there's a nice big house. And I kid you not, as an attorney for the planning department, we actually had someone justify what they were doing because they were growing turf. The law's broad and wide. And so think about this stuff when you're thinking about policy, because I'm focusing today more on policy and I'll get to implementation. But when you think about policy and how you draft policy, how you draft legislation, sometimes you need to be more specific. So rural, urban, and I just wanted to show you this thing, the 4 state land use districts. So it hasn't actually changed much. That's from 2011, but it hasn't changed much since 2011. You know, rural is that's an experimental thing, less than 0.1%. But most of the state is 5% about is urban. And a lot of it's conservation, where BLNR, Board of Land and Natural Resources rules. TMT is in a conservation district. And that's why they're reviewing the permit there. And the agricultural district. And part of the problem with this setup, so much land in the ag district, because we're an ag state, that's our roots, our DNA, but that's not really what we're focused on now, but that's our DNA. So this puts a lot of pressure on the land use system, because then you start trying to figure out how you get around the limitations of the ag district. And that's where you get to this state special use permits. Yeah, state special use permits under Chapter 205. It's maddening to somebody who cares about long-term planning. It's a big loophole. You get one of these, you can do whatever you want on ag land. There's no limitation to it. It's whatever's approved by the Land Use Commission if it's 15 acres or more, or the county if it's 15 acres or less. And counties might adopt criteria, which is great, but it's still a big loophole, I think. So that's the State Land Use Commission. So, oh, by the way, so if you're doing a development, the other big thing that the Land Use Commission does, besides initially setting up these districts, and because there's so much land in the agricultural district, so Ho'opili, you know what Ho'opili is, like project out Everside and Coal Ridge, big projects out there. Those were originally agricultural land. So in order for them to get a housing development, I think Ho'opili is about 30,000 units, residential, multifamily, where you have more than one unit in a structure, and then single family. So in order to get that in the agricultural district, they have to go to the Land Use Commission and convince them to change it to urban, to urbanize it. So it becomes an urban district. And in order to get into an urban district, there's all this criteria you need to meet, do an EIS and public meetings and all that sort of thing. And they got their designation. So that's not too much more, I think, is happening in this area. Really, it's slowed down. The neighbor islands have more district boundary amendments, like on Maui, where most of the island where I'm from is a lot of it's agricultural or conservation, not too much urban. So there's some petitions before the LUC to urbanize some areas in the fringe. But Oahu, I don't know of any. The other big land use law in Hawaii is the Coastal Zone Management Program. And so I mentioned the special management area permit previously. So if you have a project that's in a special management area, so this map here shows the Kaka'ako Community Development District. That's one of the districts that we manage at HCDA. The hash lines is the special management area designated by the state and managed by the Office of Planning and the counties. So if I'm going to build something in this district, which pretty much goes, it's pretty much the first major highway around the coast. So if you're doing any development in that area generally, you'll need to meet certain criteria. And the purpose of the Coastal Zone Management Act and the special area permits are to preserve, protect, and where possible, restore natural resources of the coastal zone. And for us at HCDA, our projects in the Makai area where the hash lines are, we go to the Office of Planning for an approval. On other places on the island that's outside of our district, the city is the land use district. So you need to go to the city council for an SMA approval. And then in the other counties, you go to a planning commission. So everybody does it differently, but it's the same set of criteria that you need to meet. And if you look in the law, it's 205A, chapter 205A, if you're interested, there's guidelines and there's some very specific criteria that have to do with these elements: preserve, protect, and where possible, restore. This is sort of the bane for a lot of developers because there is a public meeting component to it. And it's what we would call a discretionary approval. So there's two kinds of approvals basically in land use. There's an over-the-counter or ministerial permit. So like a building permit, you do A, B, C, and D, and you get it. The concrete's a certain thickness, the walls are so wide, the setbacks so check, 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 you get your building permit. Discretionary approvals are, there's usually a board and there's criteria, and they apply the criteria to the facts that you're presenting to them, and they make an evaluation, and it ends up in a decision in order. So I keep talking about TMT because I assume you're all at the university and you're familiar with that, but that was a discretionary approval in a contested case. Contested cases are, throw this all at you, you're gonna get tested later. Contested cases are quasi-judicial. What does that mean? It's like a court. And the reason why, so the board members sit like judges because they're evaluating facts that are coming into them and they applying criteria. And the reason why we set it up that way in administrative law in the state and also in the federal government, they have an administrative law process. It's because you're taking away the rights of the landowner to do certain things. They can't just do whatever they want. We're restricting their rights. So under the administrative law, they get to have a contested case. And in contested cases, if you can show that any one of you has an interest in what's being proposed, that's different from the general public. So you have a more specific interest. You live next to the project. You go to that beach and you're going to be impacted by runoff. You can be you can petition to be a party. And then your presentation has the same weight as the developer. But you have to be strategic because you probably need an attorney or someone who knows what they're doing because it's a very formal process. So coastal zone, getting back to coastal zone management program, special management area permits are that contested case process. Land use commission decisions on boundary amendments that I talked about are contested case processes. DLNR's Board of Land and Natural Resources for the conservation district permits like TMT are contested case processes. Federal consistency, if you're doing a project that uses federal funds or land, you'll need a federal consistency review, which is not as intense as an SMA permit, but Office of Planning gets involved. And they, again, looking at preserving, protecting, and where possible, restoring natural resources. And that's a unique federal-state relationship. There aren't too many situations where the federal government needs to come to the state and say, hey, state, can you look at my project and see if there's impacts? That doesn't usually happen because federal government, state government, local government. But this is a partnership that we have in coastal states across the country, and Hawaii has a program National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. They manage it, and Office of Planning is the lead agency, and the counties administer. Coastal Zone Management Program. And this was I really liked working in this program when I was at the Office of Planning, because that's where we did the climate change stuff. We're able to talk about coastal hazards, and by justifying the work that we were doing as coastal hazard work because of resilience. Remember, you have to talk in code in Congress about climate change, resilience, coastal hazards. So we could do climate change adaptation as a priority guideline. And our Ocean Resources Management Plan brought all agencies together to look at things like green infrastructure, impacts from sea level rise, dealing with runoff in construction, and those sort of things. So the Coastal Zone Management Program is great because it has this statewide finger on the pulse of land use and works with the counties and federal government in a partnership that's unique. And then the other big law we have are shoreline setbacks. So in addition to, if you're in the SMA, and we deal with this a lot as a landowner or administering land use in HCDA in the Mackay area, that map I showed you, shoreline setbacks are important because that tells you where you can build if you're along the coastline. So the setback is, first of all, you need to decide, you need to figure out where the shoreline is. And once you figure out where the shoreline is, there's a state setback, and sometimes there's a, well, there's always a county setback that goes even further back. The setback is where you can build from. So you can't put any structures, Mackay, closer to the ocean. So shoreline in the statute means the upper reaches of the wash of the waves, other than storm or tidal waves at the high tide during the season of the year in which the highest wash of the waves occur, usually evidenced by the edge of vegetation growth. So that's a mouthful. That's in the statute, and a bunch of case law made it that way. So it wasn't just the legislature. There were various cases early on in Hawaii's history that we had figured out, I think, as a state early on, even as a territory, that we would protect the public's right to the public trust, which included the ocean waters and the shoreline, and that we would have access to that. This shoreline setback is based on that ideal, which is great. When I moved to Washington State for law school, I was walking on the shoreline once, and some guy came out yelling at me. I did not know that other states have private shorelines. Did you know that? They do. Okay. So Hawaii, we're very lucky. We have open shorelines. So we just have to be sure it's kept nice and and it's accessible. The other part of it is the upper limit debris over the wash of the waves. So there's the two-part test. A lot of case law around this. You see that stuff there, the green, that's Naupaka. You know, there was this case, this diamond case on Kauai, where the landowner was artificially watering the Naupaka so it would move forward toward the ocean. And they said, well, my shoreline is down by the vegetation. And the court said, no, natural. You cannot water your vegetation and increase your shoreline. Sensible court. And then there was this other case where it was diamond, again, a different case, and they were challenging the shoreline assessment. DLNR does the shoreline assessments, by the way. And they were looking at the debris, and they were saying that the debris went beyond where you're saying it is because there are these spaces in the bushes that are planted, and the debris is up beyond that. You know, you're not looking at the debris up to the vegetation. It's vegetation or debris. And in that case, it was interesting because that was, the court based its decision in part on the lay person testimony. So somebody walking down the shoreline who said they walked on the shoreline frequently since for a long time, and they remember when the vegetation wasn't there, and they knew that the shoreline was higher back up. And the court said, well, that's evidence. You need to consider that DLNR when you do these shoreline assessments. And so that was a big change. And so, because the way that DLNR was approaching it was very scientific before. They had these very complex models, the geomorphology, the way the water moves and that sort of thing. And the court said that's not something you can hang your hat on. You also have to listen to the lay person testimony. And that goes back to the cases where the original Ashford versus Ashford case, and that was a case that looked at the shoreline. It was based on layperson testimony. So they sort of brought that in to modern statutory interpretation. So that's the shoreline setbacks. And if you're building something, you need to go to DLNR to get that shoreline certification. It lasts for 12 months, so you need to hurry and do your project or time it right. And then you know where your setback is and you can build. Another big case was the Kyoya, that remember that they wanted to expand the hotel or build a new tower. Yeah, that's right. It went beyond the, they wanted some variances to do that. And the court disagreed with how the county was interpreting the variances. It had some to do with the shoreline setback, but that wasn't the principal part of the case. So that can have real effects. And shoreline certifications can be challenged at the board as a member of the public. And what the shoreline setbacks are intended to do, it actually falls under the coastal zone management, not the program, but it falls under the same statute, which talks about coastal impacts and preserve, protect, and preservation. So the shoreline setbacks are meant to address the resources in the coastal areas. A difficult one for the shoreline setbacks for DLNR are these seawalls. You don't see a lot of this on Maui, but when I came to Oahu, one of the things I really noticed when I first got here, and this is like decades ago, but seems recent to me, there's a lot of seawalls. You just don't see a lot of it on Maui, but the seawalls is a good way to kill a beach because it changes the way the water brings the sand in and how the geomorphology of the beach. So when you permit a seawall, that beach will be gone in several years. And so DLNR is stuck with these seawalls that were permitted a long time ago, and they, we don't want to permit, but may have to because it's the property protection and it's already there. And so that's a policy that they're working through. Tough issue. So those are the big laws, I think, that govern land use. I'm not talking about 343, which is the EIS law, which is another big one, or 6E, which talks about historic preservation and burials, which is another one. And there's a lot of other big laws, but those are the big land use planning laws, the umbrella, I would say. So why was HCDA created? So I'm going to talk specifically about the Hawaii Community Development Authority. So the Hawaii Community Development Authority was created in the early 70s, and it was created at a time when the governor then and the mayor then didn't get along very much, and it was an issue of jurisdiction and who wanted to manage the Kaka'ako area, and so the statute was passed and made it the state's responsibility to manage land use. In the purpose statement of the statute, they talk about affordable housing, insufficient commercial and industrial facilities for rent. Residential areas lack livability features such as parks and open space, lack of mixed uses. They wanted the agency to join the strengths of private enterprise and public development and regulation, have longer range planning. So this is at a time when the planning department wasn't fully up and functioning. It wasn't as big. They didn't have as much staff. There wasn't much long range planning happening. So, I may be being facetious about the dispute between those individuals, but it's also made sense, I think, at the time as a vehicle for focusing development in the Kaka'ako area, which was a big landfill, and they had a smelting plant, and they had some nasty stuff there. The landfill, by the way, was, do I have a picture? Oh, this one. Yeah, the landfill was where the park is now, like right up on the water. And this is in the day when, there wasn't Department of Health regulation. They didn't do this thing where they had these geotextile liners that they put in there that's about this thick before they put the landfill in. So then you get this leaching and who knows where it's going. And capping, it wasn't capped with a geotextile. It was just gravel and dirt. So back in the day, when you could fill something right next to the ocean like that, amazing. So long-range planning, implementation of community development, determining community development programs, cooperate with private enterprise, cooperate with federal, state, and county governments. And so that's what the legislature expects us to do to carry out our mission. We have a board that hires me and does all the policy decisions for what we do. It includes as On there, the Director of Finance, the Director of Transportation, a cultural specialist appointed by the governor. That's why I have that in parentheses. At large by the governor, and at large by the Senate President, and at large by the Speaker of the House. It's very political. And then in the 3 districts that we have, He'ia, Kalailoa, Kaka'ako, I have it in backward order. He'ia was the last, and then Kalailoa, and then Kaka'ako was the first. So for each of those boards, there's 3 members from that community that are appointed by, that are selected by the county and then approved by the governor, confirmed by the Senate. So we have 4 boards. We have a big general board, we have a He'ia board, a Kalailoa board, and a Kaka'ako board. And then the Director of Planning is non-voting and sits on it. And then the DHHL chair sits on the Kalailoa board and is non-voting. So just going back a bit, I think I talk about, yeah, in that one. Okay. So where does HCDA fit in Hawaii's land use law framework? So it's the State Planning Act, Hawaii Land Use Law, Development Districts, HCDA Community. Okay, so the number 1 is the State Planning Act. We're required to be consistent in our community development plans that we adopt for every district with the planning acts. So that part about climate, the part about sustainability, that's something we need to consider and be consistent with in developing our community development plans. The Hawaii Land Use Law, state district boundaries. Our districts are all in state urbanized areas, so that's not an issue. In the community development districts, I'd say falls in between. That's what the legislature creates. So the 3 districts are what the legislature creates. They draw the boundaries. They give us guidance specifically about how they want it developed. We develop community development plans with the community, the board, governor signs. It becomes the thing we use to adopt community development district rules, which talk about development. Specifically, it's like zoning that the county has. And then we also follow, so there's a lot of confusion about what HCDA does. So for example, there was a rave in Kaka'ako a few weeks ago. We don't throw raves. We also don't approve raves. I suggest you do not go to raves. But we get all the phone calls because it happens in the district, right? Okay, so it happens in the district. It was private property. So what do we do? We adopt community development plans, and then we have rules that implement the plans that are like zoning. We do land use is what we do. We also invest in the properties we have. We've invested in a lot of affordable housing projects in the district. So we do affordable rentals on the low end, 80% of the adjusted median income, which is a technical way of saying low income affordable rentals. So we do those kinds of projects. We have several of them in the district. So those are the kinds of things we do. We do road improvements, and then we turn them over to the city. The CIP thing we talked about earlier, capital improvement projects, money is scarce. It's difficult to get money pooled together and agencies pooled together in a common cause. So HCDA serves that function by coordinating around major improvements. So we put about $250 million in the districts in infrastructure, like water, sewer, roads. The park was $23 million. That was an improvement district park project in '92. So those are the kinds of things we do to facilitate the implementation of the plans. But we don't regulate noise. So that number 5, we don't do site-specific regulations. So we don't regulate building codes. The city issues the building code. The important thing about a building code is the certificate of occupancy. Every developer wants that. Certificate of occupancy is what says that you follow all the steps you needed to so your building can open and you can sell your units and have people come into your building and open the stores. So we don't issue certificate of occupancies. The city does. We're not supposed to own roads, although we own a couple. We improve them and turn them over to the city. So we cooperate. We follow the usual big laws. We work with the city. So, we're not, sometimes the perception is that we're kind of out there doing whatever we want. I mean, we have to work with the environment that we find ourselves in. And we also have a board who's very interested in community input, community participation. So that's good. Our 3 districts, community development districts. So that's the picture of the general plan for the island of Oahu. And the general plan, well, not the text, but what the map looks like. And you know, Oahu roughly divided it up between the primary urban centers here, which is Kaka'ako's in there, and then the secondary urban center, which is the Ewa area, and the urban fringe, these things, and then the rural. So the density is focused in here, right? And the idea was that you pull development away from the areas we want to protect and bring it into a dense, walkable community. HCDA is, you know, one of our ways that we develop is to encourage and invest in and promote walkable communities served by multiple means of transportation in a responsible way. So that's Kaka'ako down here, and then He'ia is this one up here. He'ia is very different, and I'll talk about more about that later. And then this is Kalailoa out in Ewa. So Kaka'ako Community Development District, 600 acres, bounded by Pi'ikoi, King Punch Bowl, Ala Moana, down to the ocean. Includes the waterfront area, Kewalo Basin, Forest Ave. And interestingly, on its own is a little postage stamp, that old Hiko power plant down by Aloha Tower. That's in a district. Land use law is great. Whenever you see something in land use law that makes you scratch your head like, why is that there? Politics. Yeah, politics. Mixed use district, that's what this is. So for each of the 3 districts, the legislature gives us guidelines about how they want us to develop. The community development plan has to be consistent with that. Make the legislature happy, because they also give us money to invest in the community and the project. So that's another reason besides the law to follow this. So they wanted the district to be mixed use. Yeah, mixed use is commercial, residential. You know, the way of developing historically in the United States has been through Euclidean zoning. Old Supreme Court case, City of Euclid. The challenge there was that, you know, you shouldn't be able to tell landowners that they can only have residential here and only have commercial here and only have industrial here. That's the zoning regime that was being challenged, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can do that. It's for public health and safety. You have the authority to do that, City of Euclid. And so that's gave municipalities across the country that mandate that they could do zoning in that way, zoning use specific. And then we found out over time that that's a really inefficient way to plan, especially on an island like Oahu. I mean, can you imagine if certain areas were only for residential still? I mean, there's places like that, but or only for commercial. So you need to jump in your car to get there. You know, you can't live near the school, you can't walk, you have to drive. Inefficient. So mixed use districts try to combine complementary uses, so you have communities that are livable. Industrial, commercial, residential, public uses coexist compatibly, and they also wanted to respect and support the function of Kaka'ako as a major economic center. So that's what our focus is for Kaka'ako. And, you know, we've got the Kaka'ako parks, which we closed. You saw me on the news. We're having a real difficult time with the district, this part of the park, but that's a different issue. But we're looking at doing a plan update for it, and that should help with managing the park better. Go to our website if you want to learn about any of this or things I don't talk about. It's all on our website, which is at the end. Another thing we're looking at is a transit-oriented development overlay plan. Our focus there is pedestrian-focused design. We're looking at balancing destinations, density, distance, diversity, design, and demand management, so that, you know, multimodal transportation is accessible, easy, not something that you need to worry about, so you actually use it. We're looking at some height and density bonuses potentially around the transit stations because of the increased ridership. We have 2 stations in our district. And then we have the Kalailoa Community Development District, 2,100 acres, Barbers Point Naval Air Station. That was a BRAC process, base realignment. I always forget this acronym, but it's a base realignment plan. When the naval station closed down, they needed to do something with the land, and there's a federal process for how the land is transferred. That became a community development district, so now we're responsible for implementing the community development plan, except we don't have one. We have this master plan. So one of my big ideas is to actually adopt a community development plan. And so we're gonna do that. One of the big challenges out there is infrastructure. So we're looking at how we can get the utilities to work better in the district. They don't have good reliability. The FBI is knocking on my door telling me, hey, we're losing power in our brand new building, you know, that kind of thing. So we're trying to get that fixed, fixing some of the roads. And there are a lot of cultural sites, especially war, military era sites that are important to some of the constituents. So we have to focus on that. Hunt Development owns 500 acres. And so they're doing this master plan development, the work play that's north of the district. And then Kalailoa, the purpose was to facilitate the redevelopment in accordance with the community reuse plan, which is part of the BRAC process, and developing the infrastructure. And then He'ia, I say He'ia is good for the soul. He'ia, primarily wetlands. He'ia was designated as a community development district to prevent it from being developed as a residential project. Everything you see would have been houses, stores, and pavement. So it's protected by being a community development district. Primarily wetlands, formerly agriculture, previously slated for residential use. It's actually urbanized still, even though we treat it as though it's agriculture. It's actually urbanized in the state land use district. And then that's when they put the brakes on. So the legislative purpose: facilitate culturally appropriate agriculture, education and natural resource restoration. We have one tenant that leases the whole thing, Ko'o'iwi, and they're working on restoring the lo'i. They're doing a really good job out there. Working with the community. We're looking at adopting a community development plan. We haven't yet for that district. That would include, maybe a small poi mill, and the community development plan allows us to make strategic investments in the resources. Alignment with the Honolulu Board of Water Supplies, Ko'olapoko Watershed Master Plan, Management Plan, and the Ko'olapoko Sustainable Communities Plan. But I think that's redundant because we're supposed to do that for all of our plans anyway, be consistent with those plans. That's the regulatory plan I was talking about in the beginning for the State Planning Act. Okay. So specifically what the types of things that we have in our rules that relate to green infrastructure. We require LEED for our structures in Kaka'ako and Kalailoa. Applies to all new buildings and additions and renovations with a floor area of 25% or more. If you work in land use or development, you hear the word FAR a lot, floor area ratio. Basically, FAR is the buildable amount. So if you have more floor to area ratio on your property, you can build more. So that's something you throw around and sound like you know what you're talking about. Oh yeah, that extra FAR, it's pretty good. Purpose, responsible development pattern, conserves natural resources, provides a healthy environment. So LEED or a LEED equivalent we require. So some things we require through that process, we have a planning and development department, a program that evaluates all of these developments. Will require construction, pollution prevention. These are some examples of the things that we require them to implement depending on the site-specific best management practices or BMPs. This controls runoff from site development. That's a big issue. A lot goes into the developments I've worked on in the state. Backing up a little bit, it's not just a LEED requirement. LEED is a program where you get to have points and show off that you did all these great things that are sustainable for the building you're building. But a lot of the LEED requirements, these points, you can acquire them because they're required by law, a lot of them. So the stormwater quality requirements under the DPP, Department of Planning, Permitting, and Department of Health. You need to follow these requirements for point source pollution, non-point source pollution. And so yeah, it's good stuff. And then stormwater management, we require some attention to that to reduce runoff volume, improve water quality, replicate the natural hydrology and water balance of the site. In other words, need to keep and retain the baseline stormwater on your property somehow. That's what we're shooting for. So you don't harden the surface and the water goes all off into the stream and kills the reef, basically. You keep it on site, or you slow it down and you take out all of the particulates so that clean water ends up leaving the site. And there's different ways of doing that. Low impact development is something else we require. It's a way of looking at land planning and engineering design to manage stormwater runoff as part of green infrastructure. This is an example. There's a lot there, but the engineer in my office gave me this slide and I was like, do you have something simpler? You know, but it's a micro scale stormwater management tool. It's a dry well. Basically, you know, the water, it creates like a mini natural environment where evaporation and percolation, you know, takes place in the system so that the water is retained or it percolates back down into the subgrade into the soil. So you build these things around these bioswales around your flood areas. So for example, you know, we've got one project we're looking at where we have it's a road, and then on the side of the road, there's some dirt and rocks and some hardened, you know, macadam, the road material. And so the water and rain is just running over that and going straight into the culvert. So we're working with a program at UH who got a grant, and they're looking at different sites to test this approach that they're using for a bioswale. And what the bioswale is, creates a natural environment so that when the water, so that water's not just running and picking up particulates, it's slowed down, it's percolating back into the ground, it's green, you know, there's the rocks like here to slow it down. We have a flood zone requirement, and this is under our Hawaii Administrative Rules 15.2.17.61. HCDA requires developers to comply with the county's rules and the land use ordinance. And this just shows you where the flood zones are. Basically, red is bad, and blue is bad, and that's yellow, greenish thing is not so bad. But depending on which area you're in, which flood rating you are in on the FEMA flood maps, there's different types of building standards you need to follow. So this, for example, is the Anaha building. And you can see that either the steps here, we had them raise the baseline elevation so that if it does flood, it's not going to go into this first level of, this is commercial down here. That I think some of it might be residential later. So that's raising the baseline elevation because of the flood levels. And then North Shore Rack is another example. You know, this, I think we put this slide in because these kinds of solutions don't have to be ugly. You see how the vegetation is hiding what is a concrete berm there? It raises up the elevation. So that's another flood hazard mitigation. That's at Ward Village. And then another thing we're doing that is great is that going back to He'ia, they just got designated as a National Estuarine Research Reserve. And it's great because I worked on that at the Office of Planning. And then at DLNR, I worked on it because we did the Conservation District permitting for the seawall. That was a heavy lift. You know, you can't just go into this area, pick up a rock and fix the seawall. You need permits from Army Corps. So we had to work out a strategy because you need Army Corps permits and Conservation District permits to allow the restoration of the seawall. And basically the argument had to be that we're improving, by doing this, you know, we're improving the water flow and the ecology in the area. And they got a programmatic permit to do it, so it's pretty great. But now that it's the National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is a program under NOAA, through the CZM program again. CZM's great. We were able to protect this area working with the HIMBI, the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, who's out in Coconut Island, and Kakao Iwi and HCDA. We own all this land here. And the land that's owned here is the fish pond and some KS land. So that's a National Estuarine Reserve. And the great thing about it, it's a national, there's several systems across the country and they track similar things. So you can look at data across all of the different reserves, and they track things related to climate change and sea level rise and those sorts of things, ocean acidity and those sorts of impacts. And they're looking specifically at improving resilience to coastal communities and economies, flood protection, water filtration, fish wildlife habitat. They'll be monitoring the effects. And the great thing about it that makes it unique is that they're looking at how the lo'i, the lo'i and the fish pond impacts water quality as it comes down, and the corals that are out here. It's going to be great. Talk about science and culture.
I know we're out of time today. If those who want to stay to hear more from Jesse. Jesse, Suki, thank you so very much. Does anybody has questions? I think we've got a few minutes we can.
Yeah, I like questions.
Ask. If not, get Jesse's information. He is accessible, and his boss, the administrative advice is fixing here. In the corner.
Sure. Yes.
Green bioswales for an area that is only 4 foot above groundwater, an area which was previously pretty much swamp and pockets of coral rock surrounded by water. You can't go back to your original landscape when you paved it all in.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you make it green?
Yeah, a lot of it is fill. You know, all of the Makai area is fill. And so one thing that for the bioswale specifically, we're looking at it down by Jabsum along Keawe Street. There's an area where we're looking at putting in a bioswale there. The water would percolate in and around the culvert that's there. So it's really cleaning up the water that enters the system. That's what we're looking at. And it's you know, we're trying it out basically there. But for the Kaka'ako district generally, there's a lack of green space, and we do require a set aside of open space by developers. So we got the Kaka'ako 44 acres of park, including the Kaka'ako parks, and then we've got Howard Hughes putting in a large plaza as part of the project for some open space. And we require them to include stormwater quality management type engineering solutions, but bioswales are not going to work in all areas. You know, you're correct. Yes.
I was going to say, usually in those kind of situations, other strategies like green roofs or actually storage of stormwater would be probably more appropriate, but I'm curious why or if HCDA is going to try to push developers to go more that way.
Well, for the green roofs, because it's the buildings are mostly, you know, the space for green roofs is not adequate necessarily, but you know, cisterns and that sort of thing, you know, might work for some projects. But we do through the permitting process look at requiring them to implement, you know, low impact development type standards and some of the other solutions for water quality to retain water on site, or at least reduce the particulates that enter the system. We're required to do it as well.
Right, but I think some of the old development was getting rid of the old, like, where feasible clause in the county's rules.
Right.
And so then they basically didn't really do much of anything.
So,
and they've changed the rules since then.
I was going to say, yeah.
Probably have to look at systems or other types of things, but.
The new subdivision rules that the county adopted are great because they finally incorporated low impact development into those rules, and they implementing that. So and those rules are in subdivision, and our district developers or landowners need to comply with subdivision from the city. So and then we also take a look at it. So it's like a double look. Yes.
How many different agencies and regulations do you have to get permits from to comply before something can even break out?
This- I have been part of those.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. I've been part of those exercises where, for example, like broadband, we were trying to figure out, we're trying to make it easier to bring broadband into Oahu. And so we're looking at, well, what kind of things can we do as government to reduce some of the risk, make it easier? So one thing was, okay, let's do a permitting strategy. And it can be hundreds of permits. I mean, because you ground disturbance, it depends on the level of activity, right? If you're disturbing the ground, you're looking at historic preservation, 60. If it's federal money, you're looking at 106. And then if you're touching U.S. waters, you're looking at the Harbors Act and Clean Water Act, and so it's
Corps of Engineers.
Corps of
US
Engineers.
Coast Guard. It's a mess.
It's a panoply. But I will say this as someone who represented developers and represented government agencies and projects. If a permitting process is a problem for you, you have not planned right or well, because permitting is permitting and you got to get through it. But if you take the time to do your permitting schedule up front and you do diligence, it's just a process you go through. And it's not that bad because we're covering important issues. And I don't want to take up all the room time, but